We are about to have one of the most important conversations I've had on this channel in a long time. It involves questions of racial justice and critical race theory. We're going to explore questions such as this. Is critical race theory a threat to the church today? Or has it been an excuse to ignore real issues of racial injustice that persist today? Has CRT become a buzzword for all sorts of progressive ideas that have nothing to do with CRT? And is critical race theory compatible with Christianity or not? Our guests today have both addressed this topic in print and in interviews, and they're here for a cordial yet substantive discussion about these topics and more. I could not think of two guests I would rather have on to discuss this, because they've both been friends of mine for a while. Our first guest, Neil Shenvi, is not a stranger to the show. This is, I think, your fourth time on, Neil. You've talked about your book. We've talked about Christian nationalism. We've had a few conversations. You're the author of the book, co-author of the book, Critical Dilemma. Ed, you and I go back to when I was in high school. I saw you playing basketball with athletes in action with a crazy jump shot, thinking, I just want to play in college, maybe with AIA someday. And I remember a meal we had together, actually, and some things we discussed probably 30 years ago.
Wow.
Now, and we have to have that conversation. But let me tell you, your new book, Untangling Critical Race Theory, I think it's fantastic. Here's the way I'm going to frame this. If I were to teach a class at Biola on critical race theory or critical theory, I would assign both of your books. I think as we're going to get into here, where you come across this from a little bit of a different perspective, there's a lot in common ground, but we want to really highlight some of the differences of how you approach these questions today. So thanks to both of you for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Sean.
So let's just jump right in. And I want a little bit of the backstory from each of you, in the sense of why you wrote this book now, and not only why you wrote it, but what audience are you addressing? What's unique about your approach to critical race theory? Neil, since your book came out first last year in 2023, let's start with you.
Thanks, Sean. So let me read you some quotes from a different book. It's a 2022 book published so not so long ago. Here's some quotes from that book. As I continued my spiritual path toward the sacred black feminine, I wanted to stop asking, what can I prove? What is orthodox? What can be substantiated by history and scripture? Instead, I wanted to ask, what nurtures hope in my black feminine embodied soul? It's another quote. White male God's toxic trifecta of racism, sexism, and classism landed on my black female body and kept me on his plantation. And finally, more than anything, we must eradicate the transphobia within ourselves and our communities, for if God is a black woman, then she's a black trans woman, obviously. Now, those are quotes, and there are many more like it, from the book God is a Black Woman by Dr. Christina Cleveland. What makes this interesting is that Dr. Cleveland was an evangelical. She was platformed by major evangelical organizations and individuals up through 2019, and just 3 years later, she's writing a book called God is a Black Woman that is suffused with just utter heresy. I mean, she's apostate. She's no longer a Christian. So that is the kind of thing we're seeing, not always that extreme, but both in our culture and in the church. And so Pat and I, my co-author, Dr. Pat Sawyer, have been writing and talking about critical theory, critical race theory, and queer theory for 5 or 6 years now. But we thought we have to put this down in print and write a book on it because it's so important for evangelicals to understand the ideas at the heart of the woke movement in our culture, or whatever you want to call it, the social justice movement, because we're seeing that affect not just culture, but individual people and their theology, and ultimately damage their souls. So we wanted to write a book that would help Christians really understand these issues and understand why they're so important.
Ed, your book comes out June 25th, Untangling Critical Race Theory. Tell us why you wrote it, what audience you're addressing, and what's unique about it.
Yep, it's a great question, and one that I keep reminding myself of, even as this type of work starts with having dialogue with people. So I did a PhD in 2008. It was in American Culture Studies. And I went very intentionally. I already had done 2 theological degrees from a conservative seminary. And now, a decade later, I purposely put myself in a secular environment because I really wanted to understand why we operate the way we operate in America. There were some other reasons beyond that, but for now. And I got fully immersed in a world of critical theory, and everything that actually Neil has been writing about, I was experiencing firsthand in a secular environment. And what I noticed in that time was both what was disturbing to me, but also what I thought could actually be helpful in my own Christian spaces. I was already thinking about that in the early 2000s. And there were a lot of my friends, and both white and black friends, who were using lots of the language that I was hearing in critical theory, but talking about it in Christian spaces. So that's where my immersion into the whole critical theory world started. Then obviously in the last decade, it's become a popular term. Both critical theory and critical race theory have been floating around in the media. And I just saw repeatedly how I felt like it was being misused, or how it was being distorted by both sides of the political spectrum. But maybe more importantly, how I just thought it was being misunderstood in the church. And obviously we'll talk more about that, but I just thought it was being misunderstood, and that not everybody that was using critical race theory language was doing it for nefarious reasons, or was trying to come from a progressively political standpoint in their thinking. And so I finally just decided, just like Neil said, I felt like I finally just had to put down on paper what I kept talking with friends about, and they kept saying, when are you going to write this down? So I finally did.
That's a good excuse a reason to write a book. It's amazing that you were studying this before anybody really knew what critical theory was. You're uniquely poised to speak into this discussion. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think you agree, but maybe, Neil, give us a quick definition of what we mean by critical race theory, and then Ed, just tell us if you agree or you want to add anything to that, and then we'll kind of get to the substance of our conversation.
Okay.
Sure. Just to clarify, so like Ed said, you should distinguish between critical theory and critical race theory. So critical theory goes back kind of the Frankfurt School in the 30s and 40s in Germany. People like Max Horkheimer, they coined the term critical theory, and they were trying to apply Karl Marx's theories to more than just class, and understanding how things like mass media and the culture industry can disempower and marginalize certain people. And so, and Ed did a great job, by the way, in his book of explaining critical theory, the history of Marxism, history of critical theory, and then how that developed into many different disciplines, including critical race theory. So today, as I talked about in my book, critical theory is an umbrella category that encompasses many different critical social theories, including critical race theory, queer theory, intersectional feminism, critical pedagogy, and so forth. So that's just a sort of bookkeeping stuff. If I had to define critical race theory, I'd say critical race theory began as a legal movement in the late 80s and early 90s, and they were trying to understand how race has impacted American legal history and also in present-day legislation, how racial hierarchies are perpetuated, how racism can be systemic and structural. And if you look at actual critical race theorists, they have come up with several key tenets or central tenets defining elements of critical race theory. And again, Ed lays them out in his book, and I think we agree on those core tenets, at least in sort of how they're labeled. So I really boil it down to 4. They're listed like 6 or 7 or 8, or even I think we have 15 in our book. There are 4 big ideas. So here are the 4 ideas, and Ed, you can chime in and correct me if you or elaborate if you want to. But number 1, the central idea is that racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. That racism is systemic in nature. It's not just individual, like individual animus and hatred. It's also systemic. There are laws and structures and habits and values that reinforce racial hierarchy. And when you say that, people sometimes say, well, I don't get it. Racism is normal. It's permanent. It's endemic to American society. I don't see that. And well, number 2, the idea is that racism is concealed beneath ideas like objectivity, neutrality, color blindness, and meritocracy. So people will claim, oh, but we have a neutral legal system. We're colorblind today. We have a meritocracy. But critical race theorists will point out that actually those ideas can serve as mechanisms to perpetuate the racial hierarchy in America. That's number 2. Number 3 is the idea that lived experience of people of color is critical for understanding racial subordination today, that people of color have unique insights into the mechanics of racism that we should honor, and that they have sort of an inherent understanding that more than, say, than white people do of racism. And then finally, that racism is one of many interlocking systems of oppression that include sexism, heterosexism, classism, cisgenderism, ableism, and so forth. So again, 4 big ideas. Racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. It's concealed beneath ideas like color blindness, objectivity, neutrality, that we can see racism best through the lived experience of people of color. And then 4, it's part of many interlocking systems of oppression. So Ed, please feel free to elaborate or critique that if you'd like.
Well, you're right. We don't disagree about the basic tenets. And Neil, I appreciated that you had room to expand and do 15 of them. Some would say there's 20 of them, but there are similar themes that keep coming up over and over again. I think what I would say on top of what Neil just said is that when critical race theory began with those law scholars, they were confronting a particular racial narrative that was in existence at that time, which was a decade or so removed from civil rights legislation and the turmoil of the 60s. And that narrative basically said that we're good now. We don't have a race problem anymore. We can all move on and get about our business. That was predominantly amongst white people, but even some black folks and non-white folks just were glad to be able to say, laws have been passed. We're in a different place now. Jim Crow has been dissolved and we can move on. And these race scholars just said, oh, not so fast. I mean, there are consequences to several centuries of racialization that has been absorbed into not only all of our systems as individuals, but literally our structures and our systems as a society, and they don't just disappear. And so every one of those tenets is really a confrontation with an opposite that is saying, for example, there is no more racism. We just did away with it. And so Derek Bell and others said, no, we're going to say there's racism everywhere and it's absorbed into our systems, and we're going to slow down and look at how that is. We're going to be a colorblind society now. No, that's never, we're going to, everything is just based on meritocracy now. You get what you deserve. And they say, no, that's never been true. And it continues to not be true in this way, and this way, and this way. And they tried to shine a light on how it wasn't true. And that's where all the debating then happened. And it was rejected for many of the same reasons that it's rejected today, but it was offensive to people that had already drawn conclusions about where we were racially as a nation. And they were purposely being, I don't want to say offensive. They were trying to be provocative. They were trying to bring about change. They were trying to get people to see it's not all okay. So I'll stop there, but that's all I would add to it. So every one of these precepts or tenets or concepts that they came up with are really a confrontation with a particular idea that they thought was off base.
And that last point you made, that this isn't just an academic, heady subject, but is meant to lead to change, is at the root of critical theory and critical race theory, and sets it apart from many other academic isms. That's helpful. Now, I want to know, and I'm going to read a quote from each of your books and have you expand on this, how big of a deal you think critical race theory is in the church today. Is this a threat, or is this, and if so, how high would you rank it? So, Neil, here's what you said. You said in your book, a particular set of ideas has overtaken our culture and has begun to overwhelm the professing church. And then you cite in your book, one of the reasons you want to talk about this is that questions were shifting from the truth of Christianity to, is Christianity an oppressive system that is silencing people? Now, I want you to come back and tell me your thoughts on that. Ed, I want to read you a quote just so people have a little bit of contrast here. You wrote in your book, you said, far more people are questioning and in many cases leaving the faith because of negative evangelical response to conservative media-constructed caricatures of CRT than because they've dabbled in legitimate CRT categories and now view Marxism or materialist or academic sociology or any number of ungodly isms a more attractive faith home. Now, one question I have for you, Ed, is your footnote was You Lost Me, which is a book almost 2 decades ago. So I want to, in some ways, I want some of the evidence from both of you to back this up. But Neil, go ahead. I quoted you first. How big of a deal is this? How high would you rank it? And what's your evidence that this is such a big deal?
Well, is it a big deal? I think yes, just based on how many books are being published on CRT. So the quote that you referenced in my book actually was referring to the broader worldview that we call contemporary critical theory. And actually, Ed agrees there is a worldview out there based on critical theory. He calls it the progressive worldview. We call it contemporary critical theory. But we both agree there is an anti-Christian worldview out there.
Okay.
That is based on these ideas. But when we turn to critical race theory, the sort of just this academic discipline, we still reject it. Pat and I say, no, it's still antithetical Christianity, but we don't confuse the two. So I just want to make that clear that
that's helpful.
We distinguish the two, although we think both are bad. Is it a topic? Yes. So on the anti-CRT side, you have books like Owen Strachan's Christianity and Wokeness, Voddie Baucham's Fault Lines, more positive assessments. You have Love Seacrest's book, Can White People Be Saved? Romero and Liao's Christianity and CRT. Then you have even more progressive leaning books like Ekemini Yuan, Christina Edmondson and Michelle Higgins' book Truth Table, Jamar Tismy's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Then at the far end, you do have ex-evangelicals and even ex-Christians like Christina Cleveland's book God is a Black Woman, and Andre Henry, who worked for Relevant Magazine. He's now an ex-Christian, and he wrote a book called All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. So there's a spectrum of people talking about this issue, all the way from very conservative anti-CRT people to ex-Christians who are basically employing CRT as an escape route from Christianity. But what I say all the time is I don't think there's a single greatest threat in the church, because threats are all context dependent. What's the biggest threat to you is different than what biggest threat to me or to my church. So if you're a member of a historic Black church in downtown Manhattan, your biggest threat probably is not related to neo-Nazism. Just a guess, right? On the other hand, if you're a Southern Baptist church in a deep red county in rural Alabama, probably queer theory is not the biggest threat to your church. So which is a bigger threat? The answer is, well, depends. Depends who you are, depends where your church is, depends the culture of your church. So I tend to not, again, rank threats, but I do tend to say this: CRT is a threat. Neo-Nazism is a threat. Real racism is a threat. They're all threats. Let's denounce all of them. Let's just say all of these are bad, and depending which one is worst for you depends on where you're living, what your own temptations are like.
That's helpful. Ed?
Well, and I agree with that. I shudder a little bit anytime there's a question about what is the largest problem in the church today. And as I agree with Neil, it depends on where you're at and what denomination you're in and social location and all of that. I do think, though, when Neil says it's been overtaken and overwhelmed, I think that's the kind of language that causes me just to buckle up a little bit, because those are all consuming words that make it seem like it's all bad. And we can come back to that.
Yeah.
My concern has always been, again, specifically in the space of cross-cultural competency and cross-cultural relationships, predominantly between white folks and Black folks, because that's how I grew up. That's where my ministry has been. Across 30 years, I've spent the majority of my time doing ministry with Athletes in Action, which obviously has me working with white and Black athletes. My church background, again, this is all in the book. I have this experiential background where I've been thrown into a very diverse environment. And so the reason why I say that I think that more people are actually leaving because of what's not been paid attention to, rather than CRT itself, which again is a relatively recent reality for us in the church. I mean, again, when do we even want to say that started becoming an issue in the church? I'd actually be curious to see what Neil would say to that. But let's say in the last decade sometime. Meanwhile, I've watched Black brothers and sisters be incessantly frustrated, exasperated, to the point of losing their will to continue in ministry in predominantly white evangelical spaces. And why is that? Because I feel like, again, I'm making a generalization. This has not always been the case, but just painting a broad stroke. is because the majority of my white evangelical friends have not done a good job of paying attention to the concerns in the Black community, of paying attention to the Bible and through the lenses of the Black community, of paying attention to what it means to be at the leadership table on behalf of the Black community, and on and on. And again, there's nothing new in saying that. But I still think that will continue to be a problem unless we actually talk about those problems long after CRT has stopped to be a buzzword or even a concern, although it may last a little bit longer than a lot of fads do. I just think those problems are what are not being paid attention to.
That's helpful. Let me draw some generalizations, then both of you can correct me in terms of what I get right or wrong. If I'm correct, Neil, you're approaching this as an apologist, as an evangelist, somebody who's critiquing culture, seeing ideas bubble to the surface, and wanting to protect the church and better engage culture. Ed, it feels like you didn't set out to study critical theory. You were dealing with racial reconciliation for decades, and in some ways got dragged into this because this is the recent conversation about race, and you had that background training and approached this a little bit more, I don't know if this is too simplistic, pastorally and relationally. Is that even fair to the way the two of you are approaching this, and how would you correct that? Go ahead, Ed. I'll start with you on this one.
Well, I think it is fair, and that's not to say that I don't think Neil's got pastoral intentions in mind, nor would it be entirely fair to say that I don't have some apologetics in mind, because I do. But yes, I do like that as a characterization that I find even in reading. And Neil, I read your whole book, 485 pages, which is amazing. Okay, and we can talk about these books more as we progress here. And I found myself often saying that Neil is pointing out why a statement is wrong. And I find myself asking why the statement was made in the first place. And I'm glad he's pointing out why he thinks things are wrong, although I would question some of them. But I wish we were asking more, how did this person get to this place in the first place? He talks about Christina Cleveland a ton, and I don't know Christina Cleveland's whole story or her narrative, but my internal ministry antenna go up, and I immediately think, what has happened with her? It's not just been that she got exposed to critical theory or critical race theory language. That may have become the off-ramp for her, but there's obviously been a history of experience that's at least as important, if not more important, than her exposure to these ideas that gave her language for how to leave, or ideas for how to reconceptualize her faith, or now lack of faith, as Neil's saying. She had something that happened. She's had experiences that brought her to this point. And I'm not saying that I'm going to put experience above fact and these sorts of things that we get into, but I at least want to take experience seriously. As a minister, I at least want to hear the story that caused a person to start to rethink their ideas about God and definitely about people. I think most of the time what's happening, at least amongst my friends and my exposures and my ministry experience across these years, is that whether it's Black people or white people that are leaving the church, they're leaving it not so much because of theological reasons, but because of anthropological reasons. They're leaving it because of the way people have interacted with them in the church, far more than because they've had this great disagreement theologically about something. It's almost always a result of interactions, interpersonal interactions. And I think we need to give more attention to that than what's happened even in a lot of the books that have come out that Neil mentioned that are attacking these ideas. And again, I totally have a place for that. I used to be way more of an apologist than I am now. I totally have a place for that, but I just don't hear enough asking what is actually going on in these people's lives that has brought them to this point. That's not usually what happens on social media. It's not usually how we have opportunity to interact with each other in the spaces where these things are being argued about. And I wish we did more of that.
Neil, I want to come to you in a second to respond, but Ed, you and I were chatting, and maybe 3 years ago, I wrote a blog about critical race theory. And Neil, you actually read this and gave me some feedback as well. I said, how should we approach this? Number one, read it clearly, understand primary sources first. Second, read it charitably. Don't read it if you're a Christian to look for faults. Read it the way we'd want somebody to say, read the Bible, who's not a Christian. And then third, read it critically. As I thought about it, if I was going to rewrite that blog, I might add another C and say, read it with curiosity. And this is where your book really pushed back on me, Ed, in the sense of like, why are people drawn to critical race theory? What experiences did they have in the church, in their life, that they find this liberating? That level of curiosity beneath the surface relationally doesn't undermine the importance of worldview, but in a sense maybe humanizes it and personalizes it to the larger story. So that's how your book really challenged me.
I think even, and again, I want to, Neil can respond to this. I think sometimes even when we take people's quotes from books or from podcasts, original sources, and I love that Neil does that work. He impresses me with how much he digs to get original source quotes and ideas. I still find myself saying, though, what's the rest of the context of that quote? Where did this idea come from? What is the story? And this is very true in critical race theory, because in almost every critical race theory essay where ideas or precepts are laid out, there's always a narrative behind it. It's always finding its life, its animation inside of a story of something that's happened to somebody, of some injustice or some mistreatment or some dehumanizing experience that's happened that then caused somebody to give theoretical language to it, right? Again, because we're talking about academics, we're talking about people, the people that we're reading are usually people that are deep thinkers, and they do think in abstract language. They think in theoretical language, but it's always tied to some kind of an experience. And I wish we had more of that. I felt that even when I first came across Neil, who, if I can just say this one more time, I know I've been talking a long time here. I actually stumbled across Neil 5 years ago because I was wondering to myself, are there any Christian people? I must have even Googled Christianity and critical theory, and Neil came up. Because I was wondering, is anybody actually writing about this from a Christian perspective? I started to wonder that. And Neil was one of the first to enter the fray. And I very, very much appreciated the thoroughness with which he was trying to, scour original texts, most of which I was familiar with myself. But I still found myself often in his essays wanting to say, but Neil, there's more context to that statement. Even if we end up deciding at the end of the day that it's wrong, or we have our own reasons either biblically or politically why we think the conclusion is wrong, I don't know that we're being clear and charitable if we don't give more of the context of where it came from. So I would just say that and stop and pass the mic.
Neil, go ahead, buddy.
Neil.
I appreciate the think that a good contrast between the apologetic approach and the pastoral approach, or I think that's a very true contrast between our approaches. I would say that I do appreciate, and Pat and I both appreciate the pastoral approach, which is why, and also the context of like, well, why are these ideas appealing? We have an entire chapter in our book on why these ideas are appealing. We have a whole chapter, a separate chapter on the history of race in the U.S. We basically, I think it's called How Do We Get Here? So we actually look at the history of slavery and black codes and Jim Crow. We have a whole chapter on the positive insights of critical theorists, chapter 7. So we try to understand what makes these ideas appealing. Why are we as a nation still struggling with racial issues? Why are these conversations so hard? We're very open to that. And then lastly, one of the points I make in all of my talks, and again, an entire section in our book, is the need for dialogue. We actually caution Christians, don't go in with guns blazing, yelling that everyone in your church is a Marxist. Ask good questions, get to know people, invite them out to lunch, talk to them. We really need that. We want this relational aspect of when we talk about critical theory, critical race theory, we want relationships. We want love. We want charity. But I do think the other side of that is we also want clarity because, and I'll give you some examples. Think about a different issue that's also some bad ideas. And Pat deals with this. Pat, in his scholarship, actually looks at white nationalist groups and how they recruit. It turns out that white nationalist groups on college campuses, they recruit by finding young, angry, disaffected white men and saying, have you ever been made fun of because of your race or your gender? Things you can't even control. And the guys are like, oh yeah. And he's like, isn't that awful? We sympathize with you, man. Come to our meeting next week. Hear us out. We are there. We're your brothers. And they get pulled into basically a neo-Nazi group. The point is that the neo-Nazis are recruiting relationally. And if we want to connect with these young white guys and pull them out of the cult, basically, we do want to be pastoral and say, hey, explain to me why you're attracted to these ideas. At the same time, if we saw these ideas making major inroads in the church, we would say, time out. Can we establish these are antithetical to Christianity, that they are poisonous, that we want to hear your stories, yes. But we also want to say, you shall not go here. This is wrong. And the same way, there are lots of, or take it as an example that we talk about when we get to our section on queer theory. If a young girl is anorexic and she's literally starving herself to death, we want to hear our story. We want to take her hand, to listen to her. We want to sit by her bedside, weep with her. But if she's spending all of her time on pro-anorexia blogs, and they exist, we tell her, honey, log off. This stuff is poison to you. So again, I totally affirm what Ed's saying. If I were not writing a book, if I were sitting down with people one-on-one, and I have done this, and talking to them one-on-one, I would not leap into an apologia on why, or polemic on why CRT is dangerous. I would start by asking, hey, tell me about yourself. Tell me what you're interested in. Just tell me about your Christian walk. Build the bridges there, and then we'd get later to the ideas. But when you're writing a book, and our book is intentionally very, hopefully academic and yet accessible, we have to deal with the ideas. And I think where the church is faltering, I think as a whole, it's contextual, but we do try to emphasize relationship, dialogue, at least, again, I know I do. What we're weak on is recognizing these ideas are actually bad. I think a lot of people don't even get that these ideas are bad. And so they want to have the dialogue and the content and conversations, but never getting to the idea that, well, this is false, though. This is not true. And it's more than not true. It's actually dangerous. So I think, again, I see the important parts of both approaches, but I think I want to say both are needed.
Yeah. Neil, and again, I appreciate this. And, I don't want, it's funny, I just wrote a book that's got critical race theory in the title, which I didn't actually want that to be the case. That was a publisher. Let's just say we decided together to let that happen. One, because I think the issues that I'm even talking about in this book go beyond the current critical race theory debates. Okay. But two, because I'm not trying to be critical race theory guy. And I don't want to be, Neil and I had a chance to talk about this a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to debate people like Neil, because there's a ton that I agree with about, especially with what's happening in secular culture. What I don't agree with is I don't agree that the church is being overwhelmed or overtaken by these ideas any more than any other non-Christian ideas that are trying to overwhelm and overtake us. And I don't agree that they're all bad ideas. And again, so we got time to get into that a little bit, but I think Neil and I don't know Pat at all, but their work together, as I've read in these 485 pages, they've drawn some conclusions that sound very definitive, that I think have some question marks next to them, especially if there's nuance and we're able to ask some questions about it. I just think they've drawn some conclusions that are not always true. And that the lion's share of what ends up happening in a book, and what I'm most concerned about, because Neil, I thought your conclusion of what to do was amazing. In the last chapter, you just referenced it, different steps. I mean, they gave 20 steps that were all very relational based. In fact, I was somewhat shocked at it because the other 460 pages don't lend themselves, or at least for me, as I read them, don't cause me to want to have dialogue. They would tend to cause me to put a wall up actually with somebody, because the second I hear language that comes out of the person that I'm listening to that sounds like something that we've heard should be condemned outright, it shuts the conversation down. that's one of my concerns about, wow, if people even get to your last chapter, by the time they get there, I'm not sure they'd be a very good conversation partner. Honestly, that's a concern that I have with, in the midst of so much that I agree with that I read, that concerns me.
So here's a thought. So again, because I'm focusing on ideas, what would you say about queer theory? So queer theory is, as you know, like it's a cousin, ideological cousin to critical race theory. And they're undeniably, queer theory has become very popular in the culture, and there are even entire denominations. When I talk about the church as a whole, that's mainline too. I'd argue the mainline churches have thoroughly been infected. There's no question. You can read their transcripts. Methodist Church, for example. So if there are church as at large, the churches at large are struggling to even recognize that queer theory is really bad and it's antithetical to Christianity. And that's, as a whole, the church is not even sure, well, is queer theory really bad? I think you have to have a book that says, guys, it really is bad. Here are all the reasons why. Now, at the end, let's talk about how to dialogue with your LGBTQ friends. Let's talk about, but we got to establish off the bat, this is toxic poison. And I think that's where we're coming from, in that I think Christians, if we all agree, by the way, if you and I and all Christians could agree, CRT is not good, it's not good, then we can spend a lot more time talking about, well, how do we then engage with our friends, neighbors, etc. I think we're trying to establish, let's agree that it's not good. And then I think it's where, personally, I'm at, where I feel like Christians aren't yet recognizing, not ready to say these are bad ideas. They're like, I think they're kind of good ideas.
Okay. Yeah. And I've said this, I think queer theory and race theory need to be thought about and conceptualized separately. I know. And
let's talk about that. That's a big difference between us.
Let's do it.
We can come to that maybe even after I say what I'm about to say. Sure. I think they need to be conceptualized separately in the church, especially in the church. They're not going to separate them in secular culture or outside the church. I think in the church, especially, we can separate them. And I don't think that all critical race theory ideas are bad. For example, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing to think about whiteness as an ideology. And just kind of out of hand, when we just wipe that away or we just scoff at that idea, I think we lose an opportunity actually to think better about what's not only happened historically, but what continues to happen today around the idea of race. And white people in particular, white-skinned people, have tended not to think about race very well. That has not been a reputation of ours, inside or outside the church, that we've given lots of substantive thought to how racialization has affected us as a people. And so some of the better efforts at that, and again, that's a huge category, and there's lots of stuff that's been written that I think is nuts, but not all of it. There's been a lot that causes me to think, what does it mean to move through this American experience as a white-skinned person now in the year 2024? How is it different than what it meant back in 1980? I mean, there's a lot of good questions that come out of it. Well, how does it continue to affect the way we think about church and what's important to us in church? I think those are very good questions to ask that I don't have to out of hand just get rid of. As an example, and again, I know even saying that probably triggers a lot of people as they listen to it, but I would challenge people to actually read more about whiteness as an ideology and just ask, where is this contradictory to the Christian faith? These sociological observations of what it's meant to be white in this American journey. Again, I'll stop there. I don't think that doesn't have to be a problem.
Let's come back to the question of whether CRT in principle is compatible with Christianity. Your thoughts on what he shared about whiteness as a whole before we move to that, Neil.
Oh, the whiteness thing. Okay, this is interesting. So throughout Ed's book, he cites a number of Christian evangelical authors, actually. And it seems like he cites them positively. as example. He doesn't cite them just as like, oh, these are cautionary tales. He said there are Christian authors who've engaged these ideas about whiteness, and he seems to think that they're positive examples. He cites people like David Swanson's Rediscipling the White Church, Latasha Morrison, the author of Be the Bridge, and things like that. Well, that kind of surprised me because some of the people that he cites have said things in the same books, not just other random places, but in those books that are actually, in my mind, really troubling. So here's an example. He cites David Swanson's book, Rediscipling the White Church, and the quote he cites, Ed cites, is just, an unobjectionable quote. But here's in that same book what Swanson says. We, that means whites, are a damaged people. In the past, most of us have ignored the hidden wound, the result of our devilish bargain for controlling power. We don't think of ourselves as privileged, as having been given a leg up at someone else's expense. But if we are still long enough, we might begin to sense the damage we carry, the damage with which we are complicit, the damage we've inflicted. And if we choose to trust the voices and experiences of people of color, our capacity to feel this damage will grow, and with it, our ability to challenge the destructive demands of whiteness. Let me give just one more example. Again, he cites an essay called The End of Mission by Andrew T. Draper in the anthology, Can White People Be Saved? And he cites it positively, and this is Draper's description of whiteness. In that essay, Draper also says things like this. Whiteness is best understood as a religious system of pagan idol worship. And this, as idolatry, whiteness must be dealt with like any such cultic system. Its high places must be torn down and its altars laid low. Final quote, if whiteness is a way of life into which its novitiates are discipled, then a Christian discipleship that entails a deconversion from whiteness is necessary if any true experience of reconciliation with God, others, the creation, and ourselves is to take place. Now, I'm not claiming that Ed endorses those quotes. He didn't quote them. You can quote a one quote that's good and then not like other things in that same book. So I'm not saying Ed's saying that. What I am saying is it's hard for me to understand how Ed thinks that CRT is an overblown problem within the church when he's citing authors and even the very essays that contain statements that most of us look at and just our jaw drops and we're like, this is awful. We need to be deconverted from whiteness to be reconciled to God. Now I get that they're defining those words to mean something totally different than what it means in everyday parlance. I understand that. But is this really a healthy way to approach racial dialogue? Whiteness is idol worship. You have to be deconverted from whiteness. And again, there's other authors too that he cites in the very books that he cites where it's filled with statements like these. So that's why I think this is I see a problem here. I think most Christians listening probably see a problem too.
And I think, Neil, I'm here, we're here to have a conversation about this, and I appreciate you. I really do. But we're here to push back on each other a little bit too. I think you make that statement pretty regularly that most Christians this or most Christians that. And as a white person, I would say, first of all, don't say that so quickly. Second of all, after you read the Swanson quote, I would like to put that in front of a group of white people and say, discuss. Talk about this. What does he mean by this? How can he say this? What would this mean? If they weren't able to do anything with that, I'd like even better if I had some maybe non-white people who were present who could say, what do you think he means? Why would he say something like that? Again, let's at least have that discussion. And you guys, I have done that and have been part of an organization that has actually done specialized in that, having those kinds of conversations over the last 25 years. And I think really redemptive things can come out of a paragraph like that. Now, again, the Draper quote, I don't know how people would get their minds around it being a pagan ideology. But again, before I just dismiss it out of hand or say most people's jaws would drop at that, I would say their jaws might drop because they don't really know what he means. At least let's ask him, explain that to us. Why are you saying that? Which I'm guessing the rest of his book is an attempt to do. That's why I say you can't just take people's quotes and just take them out of their context. You're not distorting it by taking it out of its context. You're just stripping it of the narrative that it lives inside of. And we need to ask more about what that is. Tell us more about that. Oh my gosh. Even then, I wish people, if their jaws drop, their next thing would be to say, tell me more about that. Like, how in the world can you say that instead of just saying, well, that's junk. That's wrong. That's not biblical. That's where I have a problem. And I think the conversation just stops right there instead of saying, obviously, these are smart people that are, whether they're smart or not doesn't even matter. They're people that have purposely put these ideas out here. I'd like to hear more about why or how they justify saying what they're saying. And I don't think we've done a very good job of that collectively. And that's part of our problem.
Ed, let me ask a question, and Neil jump in here just for clarity, because you don't mince words in your book that you take issue with critical race theory and critical theory. You write on page 45, you said, I'll start by saying I agree that CT should be chastised for its illiberal, cynical, and unredemptive vision for the world. As a strategy to dethrone the ruling class and its values, it simply replaces one evil with another in the name of setting people free. So You're really clear. So I guess my question is, when Neil reads those, you're familiar with those books. Are you saying, yeah, in principle, I agree with you that those are deeply problematic ideas, but I want to know what we do with this, and I just want to use that as a tool to get people thinking and talking, even though I take issue with it? Or are you like, until I read the whole book and completely understand the backstory, I'm not willing to condemn those ideas?
Well, in terms of the quote that you read, again, even putting that in the larger context, if I remember, of why I wrote that, where I wrote that, one of the arguments that I'm making throughout the book, and again, I think Neil, I'm not sure what Neil thinks about this, actually. I'd like to hear him respond to this. I think there's a difference between a theory used as an analytical lens versus a theory that's part of a larger worldview. And I thought at least one of the more helpful insights that I had for myself over the course of trying to figure out how people are interacting with these ideas was wherever I talked about, if you come to these ideas with a stable Christian worldview in place, which again, that's a big if, then it's very easy to take any one of these things and do what I just did with it. Discuss, how is this true or not true? How does this play out in your part of the country or in your denomination or your parachurch organization? The Swanson quote, for example. Let's talk about that. That's not a threat to my Christianity to have that discussion. Now, there's people that are at the other end of that spectrum whose entire worldview has been shaped by critical ideas, who, first of all, don't believe that there's a God anywhere to be dealt with, who really do believe that there's nothing but power plays in place. Okay, it's a purely humanistic way of viewing the world, and they're drawing upon each of the critical ideas, like Neil suggested, are out there for each of the disciplines, the academic disciplines that exist. They're taking that as a whole package, and that's how they go through the world. That's what's dark and nihilistic and suicide inducing when you really don't have a God or a potential savior, when you really do come to realize that there's really no even point to this life. In fact, there's a lot of those guys actually that were writing critical theory in the 1900s committed suicide or just kind of went off the edge at the end because they lost hope completely. Okay. And yeah, if you're going to take this whole thing as a total package, there was a word that Neil kept using that I read yesterday where he did kind of make a distinction of, if you go all in on this, this is what's going to happen. And I say, good. Yes. And there's a difference between going all in on it as a worldview versus taking individual ideas and allowing them to be theoretical lenses through which we ask questions about social reality.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sorry. So, yeah, Ed, this is a great example of it, because what I'm pointing out is you think, oh, well, but we can ask questions about these authors and ask them, well, why would you say that? But lifting them up as examples of people that, again, you seem to be using positive examples. Like there are Christians you can engage carefully and biblically with these ideas. Like, I don't see that they're doing that. Here's another example. So Latasha Morrison, you opened a chapter, one of her chapters with her speaking to Crew. Here are, in 2019, her organization, Be the Bridge, which they're planting groups all over the U.S. working towards racial reconciliation. So this is a major organization. Her group printed a list of 16 bridge building tips for white people. And they include, here are some items in that list. Number 2 says, don't take up too much space, metaphorical space in the conversation. Take this opportunity to sit quietly and elevate the voices of people of color. Number 4, don't white-splain. Number 7, do not explain away a person of color's experience of oppression. Take their word for it. Number 9, don't demand proof of a POC's lived experience or try to counter their narrative with the experience of another person of color. Number 11, don't chastise people of color. Provide space for people of color to wail, cuss, or even yell at you. Number 15, don't get defensive when you are called out for any of the above. When a person of color tells you that your words /tone /behavior are racist, oppressive /triggering, you stop. Don't try to explain yourself. See number 6. Now, again, if Morrison's presented by you, presumably as a person who is engaging with these ideas and is treating them carefully and as a biblical worldview, what am I to make of her advice to white people in her group that she's in charge of? And this is beyond the point of, well, why does she say that? I'm curious why you say that, but I'm also saying you shouldn't say that. This is no way to foster racial dialogue or unity, telling white people to be quiet, don't take up space, don't defend yourself, let people curse at you and wail at you. I'm like, one-on-one, I'd say, hey, this is Morrison. Ms. Morrison, tell me why you think this. Tell me about your background. Tell me a little bit more about your story. I thought there were good parts of you, but I would do that personally. But she's not someone, in my view, who is taking these ideas, and applying them faithfully, the biblical worldview. It seems to me she's doing the dangerous thing, which is embracing these uncritically, and it's spilling out into really, really terrible advice for commands, instructions for Christians. This is for Christians, by the way, not for random people. So help me understand. So you see the difference between saying, hey, I wonder why you say that, and then commending this as, it's good that you're saying this. It's true. Yeah. It's healthy.
Yes. And so I will say this. I love Latasha Morrison, and I see you quoting her all the time and saying even what you just said. And again, for the sake of this conversation, I look at that stuff and I shrug my shoulders and say, I get it. This is what I think, Neil, actually, when I've read you and even when you're talking right now, I always think to myself, what has your experience been with white people in the church? That's what I think, because I think I have a shared experience with, again, it's a generalization because I know white people all across the spectrum when it comes to this racial conversation, but most of them have not been very substantive in their ability to deal in cross-cultural situations. Most of them have been, and I know problems that everybody has with D'Angelo, but they've been pretty fragile whenever it comes to trying to talk about race or racial issues. I've watched that across the decades. Whenever there's been sort of a social trauma that's popped up, white folks have, in my spaces, have not been particularly effective in their engagement when it comes to racial conversations. So when a Latasha Morrison finally comes to the conclusion that she's basically saying, you would be better white people if you want this to move forward, if you just shut your mouth. What immediately comes into my mind are a bunch of stories where white people did the exact opposite. In a situation where they should have been asking questions, they should have been trying to get understanding, they should have been empathizing with a horrible thing that's happened. They instead are coming to the table with statistics and arguments for why he's a criminal, or I've watched this happen. And so now the conclusion for a lot of these authors and a lot of these Black people that are writing books is, okay, how about you just be quiet for once? Now, when you pull that out of the book and we just take that as abstractly, white people just need to be quiet, that sounds terrible. I get that. But in my lived reality with white people, I think I probably should have kept my mouth shut more and asked questions. It doesn't mean I don't ever get to talk again or I don't get to have an opinion. Now, at Bowling Green, when I did my PhD, it did mean that I had to keep my mouth shut indefinitely and didn't get to have an opinion. Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, that was different. But in these Christian spaces, I'm not offended by that. I'm really not.
Yeah, I mean, you asked my personal experience. I know Sean knows this. I'm half Indian, so I'm not entirely white. But yeah, I'll just say again, this is just my experience. So my experience, I became a Christian in grad school, when I was 22, I guess, and it's been positive. I've been part of increasingly conservative evangelical churches as a Christian, and the Christians that I've met personally are the most loving, kind, compassionate, sensitive, gentle people I've ever known. And and I go to a Southern Baptist church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I go to I'm part of a homeschool co-op. It's multi-ethnic. We have 30 to 40% of our students are people of color. And we just get along because we all love Jesus. And so, yeah, I'm totally okay, by the way, with saying, well, Neil, your experience is very unusual. Okay, totally fine. I know the data. In our book, we talk about 20% or more of white evangelicals are opposed to interracial marriage in 2024. It's way worse than it is among non-Christians. So I would trust the data over my lived experience every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So, but I'm just saying, when people come to me and say, well, how about you? I'm like, well, this is what I've experienced. And conversely, I have seen critical theory and critical race theory utterly destroy people that I love. They went from being devout, orthodox, loving Christians to just going deeper and deeper into progressive theology, sometimes apostatizing. People that I knew personally, and I wept and said, don't go this direction. We love you. We want to talk about race. We want to talk about these issues. But it was like once they got sucked into this way of thinking, I was just propping up white supremacy, even though I'm half Indian. I'm propping up half Indian supremacy, I guess. My only point is that I want to attach this discussion from experiences because I 100% believe that your experiences have been different than mine. 100% agree. But that's why it's important to focus on ideas that are apart from experiences, because people can come to you and say, well, my experience is different. Again, agreed, doesn't affect reality, though.
Yeah, but the ideas mean something different inside of different contexts. They show up in different ways. And again, let me just say this. I appreciate that, Neil. And I have examples of people that have gone off the edge. I don't usually think of it as though being primarily because they got exposed to critical race theory or critical race theory ideas. And I think I already said this. I think that ends up becoming the tip of the iceberg for them. And I'm thinking of specific people even, that it was all these other traumas, these experiential and anthropological traumas in the church with people that caused them to say, I'm done with this. And again, were they saved in the first place? I don't know. Again, I've been in ministry for a long time, and people's spiritual journeys are up and down and all over the place. So I want to be super careful. Even when we talk about Christina Cleveland, the other two women that are on that podcast, by the way, they're still orthodox in their beliefs from what I hear from people that know them. So I don't know exactly why Christina Cleveland winds up where she winds up. I know she's using language that definitely supports your argument, Neil, but I think it's more complicated than that. And I have plenty more examples where being in church settings with people, I have two different kinds of examples that are way more, they're bigger for me. One is that the majority of white people, and I've been in, unfortunately, lots of different churches across 30 years for a bunch of different reasons. And my experience with most white people in those settings is that they don't do well with the race conversation. They don't have a substantive biblical background. They do think more politically than they do prophetically when it comes to injustices or marginalized people groups. Again, that's my experience and my exposure. The other thing that I've experienced is that when you put these ideas, and again, we keep saying these ideas, maybe let's talk more specifically. Let's just use the David Swanson quote again, that whiteness quote, and basically saying that white people need to get their act together in different ways. Or Latasha, like you talked about, I have that long speech that she gave in the book, where she's calling us to lament for these different racial injustices and social injustices that have happened, some of which I've been maybe indirectly a part of, and many of which I wasn't. But when I'm forced, this is the bigger idea, when I'm forced to talk about it and think about it, I've seen really good things come out of that. I've had tremendously redemptive conversations with mixed audiences over the idea of white privilege and what privilege looks like in society, and seeing really, what do I want to say? It's moved people closer together having that conversation. I've also seen it go really bad, depending on who was leading it or who the facilitator was. But I don't blame the idea for being the problem as much as I blame the facilitator or the people's willingness to come and have an honest conversation about something. So again, for whatever that's worth, that's what I've watched, what I've seen and experienced.
Do you want to jump in here, Neil, or I could keep us going?
Just really quickly, I would just say that all of that is independent of whether the idea is true or false. So, for example, I could say some people, I've seen some conversations about how sex and gender are totally different. Some of them go really well. People are brought together. Others don't go so well. The facilitator is bad, and so they don't. But that's not really the issue. The question is sex totally distinct from gender? That's a separate discussion. Or talking about the Trinity can bring people together or can pull them apart. Well, yeah, but does the Trinity, is that a true doctrine or not? So I think it's important to have that conversation almost at least in parallel with, well, how's it bringing people together? So white privilege, for example, is that concept as it's understood by critical theorists, is it true or false? Or how true and false? But we can't just say, well, let's judge it based on whether it does good things for people's relationships. But it's immaterial.
It's not that simple, though, Neil. And I probably wrote "it depends" 100 times in your book, because again, you are coming to what seemed like the way you're writing and the way you talk it is a binary. It's the one time I actually talk about you in my book, is that I feel like you lay these binaries out there where it's either got to be this or it's got to be that. And in social theory and in social situations, there really is, and I know this has become a really negative word these days, but there is nuance that needs to be taken seriously. The details do matter, because it may look or mean something different in this situation than it does in another one. Again, I don't know how to prove that to you or why it is that you don't sense that in yourself. But again, we view it differently. I totally am for the facts. And before people are going to fill up the comment section with how I'm all about experience and don't care about the facts. Yes, I do. I just know that in social situations between two people, things are a little more complicated than it's either this or that. Not the fundamentals of the Christian faith, but definitely when we're talking about racialization and our social history around race, it is more nuanced. So you say that we can't, you've already said it. You think what David Swanson said is junk. I'm saying, I think it's actually insightful. Now let's talk about that. Let's talk about why that could be an insightful statement that David Swanson made, and not just rule it out and say, no, those are evil ideas that we could condemn white people. It's almost like, and I can't believe that you mean this, because I also see you write differently than what I'm about to say, but it almost seems like you gave this huge racial history, which was profound and disturbing. Mm-hmm. And it got up to into the 1960s. And it just kind of made me chuckle to myself, because this is exactly why critical race theorists started writing. Because you do this profound history that stops in the 60s, basically. And it almost seems like you're saying, we're good now. Like, there's been some consequences. Yes, there's still some latent racism that pops up here and there in people. But there's not much talk at all about what it means for that to have been absorbed into our systems or structures, or the patterns and policies that have been developed that maybe still exist for us in some, for sure, parachurch organizations and denominations. Those patterns and policies still have effect today. And you don't talk about that hardly at all.
We do, actually. So we pick it up in chapter 7.
I know.
So we have a section entitled "We Are Not Living in a Colorblind Society." We have a talk about all the positives of critical race theory. So we pick it up. So we do end at 1960 in chapter 7, chapter 2. But then I think we even might say, but go forward to chapter 7, we'll finish the story here. So we totally agree with that. And we say, hey, actually, one of our sections, like 5 pages, is on present day discrimination. It was continued. We didn't just stop.
I read it.
Yeah.
I read it.
So that's why it wasn't. We just ended. History didn't end in 1967 with the Voting Rights Act, or 65.
It does feel that way, Neil. For whatever that's worth, it feels that way. Almost like you got to kind of throw a little bit of statistics in to show that there's still some problems. But the lion's share of what it ends up feeling like is that we're pretty much good. That white people in the church, this category, if we could even call a category of people, white people in the church, they're pretty good. Most part, every once in a while, racism slips out of them. But for the most part, they're really good when it comes to dealing with these issues. That's what it feels like.
In chapter 1, in fact, we even talk about how high the prevalence of opposition to interracial marriage is. It's the very first chapter.
I know, but there's more to it than that. That is a stat you threw out, and then it's hundreds of pages saying you can't even have this conversation. That's what it ends up feeling like.
But we have a whole section on the need for dialogue at the last chapter. Anyway, let me go back to what you said about the binary thinking.
Okay.
You criticized our article in the Gospel Coalition, saying that you can't accept critical theory in Christianity; they're incompatible. And you criticized our statement that Christianity says that our fundamental problem is sin, whereas critical theory says that our fundamental problem is oppression. And you said, hey, sin can be our fundamental problem, but also oppression is a problem. And I agree, though, but we didn't say that. We agree that sin's our fundamental problem, and also oppression is a problem. But we didn't contradict that. We said you can't have both as your fundamental problem. One's fundamental. Your fundamental purpose in life, your fundamental identity. And you kept saying, well, they can be. It also can be, fundamentally we're Christians. Yes, I agree. You'd say that. It's good. I affirm that too. I'm glad you affirmed that. Then you say, but also we're black or white or Asian or male or female. But again, we agree with you. So we're in agreement. But there is a binary when it comes to what's your fundamental problem, fundamental identity, fundamental purpose, fundamental source of meaning and value. That's what we're probing. And again, in your book, I say this repeatedly, but you recognize that what you call the progressive worldview, which we call contemporary critical theory worldview, that is a fundamental worldview. It's answering those fundamental questions, and there is a binary there. It's like saying fundamentally you can't be Muslim and Christian, because fundamentally Jesus is either God's son or not God's son. And I think that's what it comes to. So, and I agree. By the way, I do, and this is why we have chapter 7. We have an entire chapter on the nuance stuff. There is nuance. Is there a sense in which majority culture white people cannot see racial issues as clearly as people of color? Yeah, of course. In the same way, is there a sense in which Americans in France don't get French culture the way that French? Of course there is. It's obvious, right? And it should be obvious. I get that many people just want to throw everything out and say it's all just demonic. So we're trying to bring nuance, but at some point there's a fundamental disconnect when you ask the big questions. And there's a fundamental disconnect when you talk about things like, or an example, are whites guilty of ancestral sin, right? That's a fundamental question, and the one that the Bible answers, we think, clearly. So the point is just that, I agree with you. We sometimes we need nuance, but we also need clarity on the big questions. So I think that's where I push back.
That's good. That's good to hear that. And you did keep underlining fundamental.
Yeah.
To which, again, my mind goes, worse. I'm thinking about people in the church and how big of a problem it is in the church. My experience with people in having these discussions around these topics using this language, their fundamental commitment is to the Lord. Their fundamental commitment is Orthodox Christian. And on top of that, they're using these lenses to try to have these conversations about race, or about cross-cultural competency, okay? So when there's a condemnation and we're saying that they're incompatible altogether, which is how people wind up reading you. And again, I think you mean this. I'm trying to get in your mind. I really have been. That's why I read the whole book. I've had the privilege of being able to read way more of you than you've been able to read of me. I got one shot at it, right?
Well, I'm prolific, yeah.
You are prolific. And again, I appreciate that. You put a lot of words down on paper. And so it ends up feeling like you're saying it's either or, and that if you start to dabble in these ideas, you're almost necessarily going to wind up giving up your fundamental belief in the Lord. And that's what I've been pushing back against for years. And this even happened with, the Southern Baptist Convention with resolution number 9, where they wind up, there's a group of them that are saying, no, you can be grounded in an Orthodox Christian worldview and use these as lenses through which to look. And it seems like the response to that from you and others has been, no, you can't. And that's really what I wanted to push back, to say, well, yeah, you can actually. You don't have to give up your fundamental belief in Christianity. In fact, they would have to give up their fundamental belief to get something out of the Christian worldview. I think I said that in there somewhere. They're the ones that would have to give everything up because they'd have to believe there was a God. They can't just take stuff from Christianity into their view and it still makes sense. We're coming from a theistic worldview that also then allows us to look through different lenses at social reality around us and see how it aligns with the Christian journey that we're on. I don't know why you say you can't do that.
This might blow your mind, but I actually supported Resolution 9 and got a ton of flack from it, from fellow conservative evangelicals. And I said, I'm defending myself, I said, look at the actual text, read it, read what they're saying, read what they're not saying. And I did say there's some problems with it. I was fully open with that. But on balance, I thought it tried to do what you're doing, which is to say, as a worldview, it is false. As a very specific tool, it can be useful. And if you disagree, then go to the Bible. But I said, on balance, I had some issues with it, but I supported it. I got tons of very angry people. But my only point is, I think this is where I keep going back to one of the big criticisms I had with that statement and others. Where are the primary sources? Don't make vague statements. Quote what you're opposed to verbatim from critical race theorists, and then say that's what we're talking about. That'll make it much clearer. So I got on both sides. So I think actually, Sean, this might be helpful to look at CRT, some specifics in terms of what we agree and disagree on. I think intersectionality, we mentioned that before. It's a great test case for can we view this, this idea of intersectionality just as a sort of tool that we can use, or is it part of a much bigger sort of almost semi-worldview, say? Would that be helpful, you think?
Yeah, so let me clarify something from the book, just to make sure people are tracking, because this is an important part of the conversation, and then I'm fine going that direction. Here's a quote from your book, Ed, on page 76. You said, authors like Shenvi and Sawyer suggest, invariably we will be forced to choose between critical theory and Christianity in terms of our values, ethics, and priorities. And then you say, again, this is you speaking, Ed, I'd argue Christians are only forced to choose when they are in the market for a new worldview or shopping for a new totality. Anchored by a Christian theological tradition, a person can embrace the Christian interpretation of history while gaining insights from CT observations about human interactions and the way power, profit, politics, postmodern realities affect our lives. Now, it sounds to me, and I want you to go first, Neil, and then Ed, come back and clarify this. Okay. It sounds like you're criticizing them for saying we're being forced to choose between Christianity or critical theory. And then you say, anchored by a Christian theological tradition, which means, in other words, I'm assuming Christian worldviews. Then we can use it as a tool within a Christian worldview, its insights, its criticism. But I think where you're going, Neil, is to say, once we do that, we are using CT or critical race theory in a way that its proponents would say we shouldn't use it. Is that fair, Neil?
That is
explain that before
exactly
we?
what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is, I agree. And actually, in our book, we even say, we say we're not saying that you can't take 30% of the insights of critical race theory and then leave the rest. And that you can't. We say, yeah, you can totally do that. We do that. I've read thousands, tens of thousands of pages of critical race theory. I'm still, as far as I can tell, theologically intact, right? But so you can do that. You can say, yeah, this is true, actually. But
there you go.
What we're saying, though, is that the reason that me and Pat can do that is because we're rejecting not only 70% of it, but we're saying if we're going to reject even the 30% we keep, we're going to run that through the filter of the Bible and of objective evidence. And if critical race theorists saw what we accept and what we reject, they would say, you're not doing critical race theory. We say, we agree. In the same way, I can gain insight. I'm trying to think of a good example. Take something like Jungian psychology or Freudian psychoanalysis, right? Or I can look at his writings and say, well, or this is a better example, closer example, Karl Marx. Karl Marx had some interesting ideas and questions that he raised about just capitalism and whatever. I can read Marx and not turn into a communist, but why? Because I'm saying I don't agree with 90% of what he says. 10% of him, like, oh, that's interesting. I never thought about that. Yeah, sure, that's helpful. But he'd look at me and he'd like, you're not a communist, Neil. I'm like, yeah, of course I'm not. I reject 90% of what you say. In the same way, we're saying, if you accept critical race theory as it's intended by the theorists themselves, then it's not going to work with Christianity. I can revise it. I think a good example, maybe one final example. If I can't tell if a Marxist says, I want to abolish private property, I can't tell him what you're saying is a misuse of Marxism. No, that's not true. What he's saying is a proper intended use of Marxism. If I'm a Christian and I say, hey, I think I can use some of the insights of Karl Marx to understand things like slave labor in Indonesia, right? But I don't think we should have a communist revolution. I don't think we should abolish private property. I don't think marriage is oppressive. Marx looks at me and says, you're misusing Marxism. And I say, yes, I am. I'm a Christian. That's what I am first. I am taking your theory. I'm chopping it apart, taking out the parts I like of it. But he's right to say, then you're not really a Marxist. And I would say, amen, I agree with that. That's the difference.
All right. I want to go to intersectionality, but Ed, maybe clarify. You said you're trying to get into Neil's mind, but help me understand where I may be missing this, because one of the things I appreciate most about your book is that you're saying we should take critical race theorists, understand them first and clearly, not defensively. What are they actually saying? What can we gain from this? Like, you really push back on people who accept just a caricature of this. Mm-hmm. And yet it seems like they're clearly saying we can't separate critical theory from, say, queer theory, or we're no longer operating on the way they want it to operate.
Yeah, and I think the queer theory thing, as I try to talk about in the book, I think that muddies the waters, and we're going to do this with intersectionality because Neil and I already had this conversation at some level with each other. And Neil says himself, he and Pat say that he said at the beginning of one of the chapters that there are many, many, many different spin outs of critical race theory. So you have these ideas, how they get applied spins out in lots of different ways. And so even when he keeps saying that the authors of critical race theory would, insist that you believe it in a certain kind of way, my insides just go, again, it's way more complicated than that. When he says he's read thousands of pages, and I believe you have, Neil, surely you've seen that there are lots of different strains of critical race theory and how it gets applied or not applied in different disciplines. Even it ends up showing up differently. It's not like there's this one monolithic way that you have to view it. And I know we're going to talk about intersectionality, which I think is the most problematic place to have this discussion. But there's all kinds of different spins on how critical race theory would get applied in different settings. And I feel like we just keep rolling out the exact same authors all the time as examples, Kendi and D'Angelo. And it's like, you guys, there's way more there are way more ideas about how these ideas get applied and what it looks like. And I feel like, Neil, again, I don't know that you're meaning to do this on purpose, but it's almost like you and Pat wind up giving us the most extreme examples, to which I would say, yes, when it shows up in an extreme way this way, when it becomes a spoke in a progressive political worldview that's taken to an extreme, I would out of hand reject that. But that is not my only option. That's when it comes to talking about whiteness, when it comes to talk about racism being endemic. There's lots of other ways to talk about it than just this extreme application in the way you guys frame it in the book often. Again, all through the book, I'm just saying there's other ways to do it than this, though. This is not the only way that it shows up. Interest convergence, that white people will only do things when it benefits them. Okay, we can find lots of examples where that has been the case. And it doesn't then mean that white people never do anything out of a moral compulsion. Okay, it doesn't mean they never do. It just means we're going to look through the lens and see where if we can find places where they didn't, where they only made moves because it benefited them too. It doesn't mean we have to take it now to this extreme that says white people never do things out of moral compulsion, if that makes sense.
And so I think...
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, for intersectionality, I agree we shouldn't go to the most extreme cases and present them as normative. But what I want to do for intersectionality, I want to go to the very earliest sources. I want to go to Crenshaw herself in the two papers that she defined intersectionality. And these two papers that you cite. So you cite these papers rightly as the source of the term intersectionality. I want to go to those two papers and then to a 1993 anthology, Words That Wound, which is written by four of the co-founders of CRT, including Crenshaw, which you also cite properly. As far as I know, it's the earliest anthology that defines the core tenets of CRT. This is as early as you can get, and as basic and as central as you. Can I read a few quotes from those sources, because those are not extreme sources. Okay, so let me start with the Words That Wound. So we're talking about intersectionality. So I'm gonna read to you the sixth defining element of critical race theory. They're saying this defines CRT, the sixth element of six. Here's what they say. I'm going to quote the whole thing. Critical race theory works toward the end of eliminating racial oppression as part of the broader goal of ending all forms of oppression. Racial oppression is experienced by many in tandem with oppressions on the grounds of gender, class, or sexual orientation. Critical race theory measures progress by a yardstick that looks to fundamental social transformation. The interests of all people of color necessarily require not just adjustments within the established hierarchies, but a challenge to hierarchy itself. Okay, that's 1993. That's 4 years after Crenshaw coined the phrase critical race theory. And let's go back to her 1989 paper. She writes this. She's illustrating what she means by intersectionality. Here's her illustration, the analogy. She says, imagine a basement which contains all people who are disadvantaged on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, and or physical ability. These people are stacked feet standing upon shoulders, with those on the bottom being disadvantaged by the full array of factors, meaning race, class, gender, everything, sexuality, up to the very top, where the heads of all the disadvantaged people are by a singular factor pushed up against the ceiling. So she's saying there's this hierarchy of oppressions from top to bottom, when people with only one factor versus people at the very bottom. The black trans lesbian is the very bottom. Here's one last quote from her 1991 paper. All of these are cited by Ed. She says, by tracing the categories to their intersections, I hope to suggest a methodology that will ultimately disrupt the tendencies to see race and gender as exclusive or separable. It's a key word, separable. Mm-hmm. While the primary intersections that I explore here are between race and gender, the concept can and should be expanded by factoring in issues such as class, sexual orientation, age, and color. So really quickly, this is the earliest sources. They are authoritative sources. This is the defining elements of critical race theory. And Crenshaw is saying, one, It's not just our identities are complex. There's a hierarchy with rich, straight white men at the top and elderly, poor, LGBTQ black women at the bottom. You cannot separate race, class, gender, and sexuality. So when Ed says, rightly, I totally agree, Ed, we must separate gender, race from sexuality. We have to maintain biblical orthodoxy. Crenshaw says you may not do that. If you do, you are flouting one of the defining elements of CRT. Now, I'm okay with doing that. I'm saying, yep, that's right. Shove it. We're not going to do this. But if you do that, our only point is this. You are rejecting CRT. At least that one defining element of it, you're rejecting it. You're not incorporating it. You're not using it as a tool. You're saying, nope, sorry.
No, I'm rejecting it at a certain point along the path. And I kind of wanted to hear you even respond to this, because when she first wrote that, and we talked about this, Neil, I think there is an academic pressure. There was an academic pressure even back then that if we're going to write about one form of oppression, we need to write about all of them. We need to watch out for everybody that is being taken advantage of, that's being marginalized in society. How can we justify only writing about ourselves? And I would guess that there were some arguments amongst the best leaders and those who were the originators of these ideas, to your point, when they were doing this in the first 5 years, the first decade. I'm guessing there was quite a bit of discussion about it, because Black folks have not benefited by being attached to the sexual and gender revolutions that have happened. That's not benefited them. It's benefited the gender and sexual revolutions to be attached to the Black story and the Black narrative more than it has the other way around. And Black folks, and again, this is a whole nother thing, but especially when we're talking about in the church, Black folks are, by and large, at least in my experience, have been mostly conservative both biblically and socially conservative when it comes to morality, when it comes to gender, and when it comes to sexuality. They may be more liberal or progressive in their thinking about race in general, but they're actually very conservative when it comes to gender and sexuality. That was definitely true back when these things were first being written. So I have no problem, and I wonder, do you have a problem with it being represented that where people are being taken advantage of, marginalized, mistreated because of their skin color, because they're a woman, because they have a different gender or sexual identity, as much as we may have disdain for that reality, those people in our society have been at the end of very oppressive behaviors. They have been taken advantage of. They have been beaten down. I just think that's history. So it doesn't surprise me when they say that we're going to stand up for everybody. Now, is there a difference between granting civil rights or a civil union to a homosexual couple? Is very different than changing the fundamental definition of marriage altogether, which is where we're at right now. That's a very, very different discussion that ended up happening 30 years down the road from we're going to watch out for people and make sure their civil rights are protected. Are you following what I'm saying? And that's the biggest problem. Again, I guess I don't know where you guys are. I do know where you are, Neil. I hold to a very orthodox view of marriage. I'm not part of the affirming church. I'm not going down that road these days with so many others. I don't believe that the original critical race theorists would have either 30 years ago. I think they were representing civil rights for people. And that's gotten applied, and that's turned into something very different now 3 decades later, in a moment that we find ourselves in when it comes to gay marriage. I'll stop.
So
respond to that.
You don't think the original critical race theorists thought that race, class, gender, sexual orientation were all, sources of oppression, and that oppression, remember, to a critical race theorist, oppression does not mean cruel, treatment, beatings, violence. It doesn't mean that. It means that the ruling class imposes its view of whiteness on you, or view of heterosexism on you, or view of gender, or patriarchy. They mean that.
I think those groups have been the recipients of both physical, literal oppression, the way you just defined it, especially back then when it was first being written, and psychological oppression. Whether justified or not, they have absolutely been the recipients of psychological oppression, whether right or wrong, in your view.
Would you call traditional marriage psychological oppression if we say, because then critical race theorists say that it's what they mean?
I know, no, but
okay,
Neil, this is what I'm saying. I think that if you follow what I'm saying, you're quoting what happened 30 years ago as a fundamental idea. And I'm saying that I'm sorry?
They say it's a defining element of critical race theory.
A handful of people that you quoted, which are very important people, say that it's a fundamental idea to watch out for civil rights for all of those groups, to which I would affirm that idea. Now, what that's going to turn into, specifically in the case of gay marriage, is something I will not affirm. I will get off the train at that point. But I absolutely would stand up and make sure that those people are not being taken advantage of or being beaten down in some kind of physical or psychological way in society. I think as a Christian, we actually should stand for that. Which, by the way, I don't know that we have a really good reputation amongst the gay population in this country either, not because we've rejected gay marriage, but because we've never known what to do with them in our church circles, which is a whole nother conversation that honestly, I don't even want to get into that right now. But we don't have a great reputation for having protected the civil rights of people that are being downtrodden and taken advantage of, whether we agree with their lifestyles or not. That's not been our history. There's been outliers. There's been pockets of Christians that have represented and stood up for those people. That's not been our reputation. And I think that's a problem. Just going back, Sean, even all the way back to one of your original questions to me, to why is it that I think that more people have actually jumped off of the more conservative evangelical train? It's because of that kind of history, because we were the last to get on board with watching out for vulnerable populations collectively. Again, I'm not saying that nobody did, but our reputation has been one of indifference at best. And sometimes we've joined in on the oppression. That's been our history towards women, towards racial minorities, and definitely towards sexual minorities. That's a problem.
I just want to emphasize, when critical race theorists say oppression, they do not mean cruel and unjust treatment and control and tyranny. This is in the quote again. They're aimed at, quote, fundamental social transformation, end quote, in a quote, challenge to hierarchy itself. They're not just saying, and remember, this is written in 1993. This is not written in 1893 when we're jailing people for sodomy. This is written, recently. So my point is, they want to remove the social stigma towards homosexuality and any kind of idea that heterosexuality is normal and good. They think that's an oppression. That's why they talk about class oppression and disability as being oppression. In 1993, were people being oppressed because they were, oppressed meaning like beaten, not for isolated incidents, but were handicapped people as a class in 1993 like being enslaved or thrown in jail? No, they weren't. They would grant that. Oppression to a critical theorist means there are these psychological problems where they see some things as good and normal and valuable and other things as wrong, but that would include homosexuality to them.
And as a Christian, I need to explore, again, some people are more comfortable with this than others, I guess. I have no problem inhabiting that space where they define oppression that way and exploring in what ways I've been complicit or my denominational history has not done a good job of paying attention to how to relieve the suffering of people, even if they're making sinful choices that I disagree with. I don't know that we've done a good job of that, Neil. And that's so I can inhabit that space where intersectionality is talked about, and I appreciate the civil rights aspect of it. I appreciate that there are classes of people that get the short end of the stick in just the way secular life works, let alone in the church. Again, that's where it becomes really problematic. Man, we don't don't have a good history towards those groups. They certainly don't. I just don't think they found a lot of relief from the evangelical world. Okay, and
I think they're not going. I think they're not going to. If they're looking for relief in terms of saying heterosexuality is just an arbitrary social construct that is used to oppress LGBTQ people, and they want relief from that idea, they're not going to find it in Christianity.
They're not going to find that, but we're talking about racial minorities. We're talking about women. We're talking about, you said, ableism.
But Crenshaw's not talking about those people only. She insists in all critical race theory. I can show you references from 2006 and 1997 and up to today. So my point is this one issue specifically, there's lots more, but on this one tenet, this defining element, Christians just have to say no. We can't accept that, as you understand it, at least.
We can't accept that end result of it. No. But Neil, I can get a ton out of the idea. I said this to you the other day. I have spent, and I'm sure you guys have too, I have spent countless hours in meetings that have been predominated by white men, and there's been a couple, maybe women. Sometimes there's been a black woman in the room. And pretty regularly, my post-meeting discussions with them, again, in relationship and in friendship, there's been feedback that reflected that they did not feel like their voice was heard, that they did not feel, with both as a woman and doubly complicated by being a black woman. Okay. Now, were there maybe reasons for that had nothing to do with racial or gender oppression, if we're just going to keep using that word? Yes. Sometimes maybe the guys were just being knuckleheads, but more often than not, my history in those spaces has been that the guys that are in the room have not done a good job of paying attention to the women, and they definitely haven't done a good job of paying attention to the racial minorities. And if it was a black woman, she has felt doubly, pick your word, left out, doubly like she had to fight for something that no one else was going to fight for. So when I hear intersectionality talked about, I say within church circles, that is actually a really helpful idea to help correct or maybe just make myself aware. It's a great lens to look through to say, we need to do better at this, guys. Are you with me? And I would want to say the same thing about any of these other groups, about any other group that winds up feeling that way. I don't necessarily have to ride this train all the way to the end of the tracks. I know that you're saying that Christina Cleveland is saying that, or Crenshaw is saying that. And I understand why she's saying it, because to be consistent, she has to continue to say that. And I'm okay with that. I can use the theory and get off the train before we get to the end, that end of the tracks.
Ed, really quickly, you suggested that at the time, maybe Crenshaw wrote this, there was kind of pressure to include all sorts of oppression. Being in the studies, I would suspect that you would maybe be more privy to that than I would, given the time you spent in your PhD. Are there any times where she's backtracked on that? Are there these conversations within critical race theory and critical theory where people are saying, no, let's just make it race and separate it? Or that's just kind of from being in there, you suspect those conversations took place?
That's a really fair question, Sean. Definitely number two. Okay. That when I'm speaking out of conversations, not so much essays that I've read.
Okay.
And honestly, well, I'll just leave it at that. It is definitely more from conversations, and it's just recognizing that there are lots of different perspectives about how far you have to ride that train down the tracks. And I know that there's disagreement amongst them. They may not go public with it because what will happen to them? What will happen to any critical race theorist that tries to dabble with the idea that we're only going to represent the racial side of this, and we're not going to represent, again, we're primarily talking about homosexuality.
That's
as
true.
Being the problem. That's it. That's the dividing line. It's dividing us in a gazillion different ways in the church right now. Okay. So it would
Agreed.
also divide critical race theorists. if they took a dissenting view of it. So, man, again, I have been saying all along, to me, it's never been all or nothing. That was not my experience in interacting with social theory. That's not the way it works, that you have to take the entire thing or else you can't call yourself this. In fact, they're constantly splintering off and coming up with new ways of conceptualizing. I agree with Neil. They've been pretty consistent about, we're going to represent everybody. We're going to take the gender and the sexuality and we're going to take all of it and we're going to keep it kind of mashed together. I think that was a mistake. And I also don't think I have to ride the train to the end of the tracks as a Christian.
That's fair enough. Neil, I want to come back and have you respond to that and your thoughts on intersectionality. I want to narrate this. In part, what you're arguing, Ed, if I hear you correctly, is that we can look at queer theory, we look at critical race theory, and as a church dig deep and ask and say, have we loved people? Have we cared for people? Have we responded the way we should as Christians? And there's a lot of fair criticism we should take to heart. I think there's a way to do that and say we need to do better, love like Jesus better, be more consistent, without embracing some of the ideas coming through various forms of critical theory. The question is, can we do that? And I think that's where we broadly, I think, agree. But let me shift back over to Neil. Your thoughts on Ed's last comments and maybe what he said about intersectionality.
Yeah, I think the bottom line for me is two things. One is that if I appreciate Ed is very clear in the book that he is going to get off the train when it leaves the station for race, class, gender, and heads towards sexuality, right? And today, gender identity. And there are other things too, actually. I didn't even get into this. And then there's way more to this than just what I said. This is the most obvious contradiction, though. What I would say is, number one, if you approach a critical race theorist, and anyone, I mean, not anyone, but I'm sure there's one rando out there who says, yes, I'm only about, race only, but I can cite dozens of papers, this, not just mentioned randomly, but they're like, this is a defining element of critical race theory. Number one, if you go to them and say, hey, I am open to being introspective about how we've treated people of color and poor people, et cetera, in my church, and how even I have been cruel towards people, LGBTQ people, and acted sinfully. I'm open to that. I'm humble about that. But I do think the Bible's clear on sexuality, homosexuality being a sin. Am I still being intersectional? They'll say no. Am I following what you wanted me to do with your theory? And they're like, no. No, you're not. I have to respect that. If they come to me and say, we're not just telling you to be more humble and kind. We're telling you to overthrow the social hierarchy between the heterosexuality and homosexuality. And cisgenderism is a hegemonic discourse that needs to be dismantled and overthrown. They're saying that. I would be doing the service to them to say, oh, you're not really saying that. It's like, you go to a Muslim and they say to you, I don't believe Jesus is God's son. And you say to the Muslim, oh, you don't really mean that. I think you're really saying he is. And I don't believe that. In the same way, when critical race theorists say over and over and over and over again, you can't separate race, class, gender, and sexuality. This is a core part of our theory. And no, we don't just mean be nice to people. We mean recognize that heterosexual marriage, traditional marriage, is oppression. That the gender binary is oppression. Recognize these things. We can't tell them what they really meant. They really mean it. And so I'm just saying, hey, let's just embrace that. Let's say, yeah, we disagree here. But let's just be honest and say, yeah, we disagree.
I don't disagree with Neil. So again, everybody, hear me say, I think that what Neil is saying is true in the sense that there is an expectation that you will ride that particular theory down to the end of the train. But even what you just said, Neil, you've got 15 different theories. Again, you're talking about this almost as though it is a comprehensive worldview. I want to talk about these things as though they are individual theories that can be looked through as lenses and we can derive application within our Christian circles. So it almost discourages me that we just spent so much time on intersectionality. I almost wish I would have just stopped it, although I really did want to hear what you were going to say, because I think that's the most complicated one of all because it's got the gender and or it's got the sexuality in it. I want us to spend more time on racism as ordinary and embedded in the fabric of American society. I think there's a ton to talk about in there. I think expressing skepticism towards meritocracy is a really important lens to look through, and not just assuming that the playing ground is equal for everybody all the time. And there aren't patterns and policies that have created an unequal playing ground even today, that it's at least worth looking at that. And my Christianity is not thwarted by that in any way. And I can still be applying critical race theory thinking. Again, I'm not trying to call myself a critical race theorist. I'm just saying I don't think I have to cash in my Christianity to be able to look through that lens. We already talked about interest convergence.
Hey Ed, can I jump in here? Tell me if this clarifies where you're coming from. Is you have concerns with critical theory and critical race theory as some of the ideas embedded within it. But you also have concern that when you make it a comprehensive worldview, then we dismiss all elements of it and aren't open to some of the conversations about, say, systemic racism, assumption about meritocracy, etc. And so you want to say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and make sure we take these questions seriously.
Good.
Is that fair to what your deep concern is?
That is fair, and I feel like the majority of what's been written, or at least what I have come across, has thrown the baby out with the bathwater. That's part of the reason why I felt like somebody needed to write what I wrote. However well or not I did, that's what I tried to do. And I would say this too, it's not just the ideas, it's more the applications. Because I don't have a problem with a lot of these ideas that, again, Neil and Pat have kind of immediately shown what's wrong with it, I think, when it gets taken to an extreme. And I share that concern. Yeah, when it ends up showing up like that, it becomes problematic. But that's not the only way that these theories can be applied or these ideas can be applied. You can have a different kind of discussion that doesn't wind up having to shame white people. You can, but when you have a hard discussion about race, some people in the room may feel shame just as a result of the topic. But it's not because critical race theory necessarily has to teach, all white kids to hate themselves and this sort of thing. It doesn't have to turn out that way. I think it can be, again, I don't want to say this about Neil because he's anything but this, but it ends up being sloppy and lazy just to make a blanket condemnation of everything. That's why I don't like focusing on intersectionality, because when you throw the sexuality thing in, it immediately gets off the rails. All these other theories, these other ideas, we need to slow down and actually look at them in our spaces. Whether you're in a Christian school, you're in a particular denomination, you're in a parachurch organization, and try them on and see how they fit and see what you can learn.
Let's do this. Let's give us an example of one that we haven't talked about that you think has been dismissed by the church, Ed, that there's a lot of credibility to. We can't solve it right now, but the kind of conversation we should be having to move racial justice forward. You can choose meritocracy, systemic racism, etc. Which of the components that's typically a part of critical race theory should we be more open to and discussing?
Okay, good. How about let's do racism is endemic, that it's natural, that it's ordinary, which what flows from that is that it's hardwired into the system. Again, there's different language that you could use for this, because I think I've thought more about this than almost anything in my spaces recently. What this is going to wind up asking us to do is not to try to figure out where all the racists are in the room. Like that. No, that's not the point. It's not to try to decide how far we've come, relative to where things were in Jim Crow. What it should get us to do is just ask, are there patterns and policies in place that have continued to maintain a racist direction, a racist end result that we just are not paying any attention to? So, for example, in the book, I use the Christian school example, and everybody's going to be trying to figure out, all my friends will be trying to figure out which Christian school it is. And the reality is I've been associated with 4 different Christian schools who all have a very similar background in that they started in the 60s and 70s as a direct result of not wanting to have desegregated schools. That was at least one of the reasons why they started. And I know this from having had conversations with at least one of the people, okay, one of the schools very directly, and I've heard about the other three. So are there racists currently in the school system? I don't know. Were any of these people around in the 70s when it happened? And the one school I'm thinking of, the answer is no. But were there things that were set in motion back then that continue to be in place today that affects who they hire? Why is it that they only have white people that are teaching at the school? That affects what they end up teaching and looking at socially in their classes where they're looking at current issues, what they talk about. And again, I've got very specific examples of an unwillingness to look at race as a social issue, even while things are burning down around us. Okay. That who's going to get scholarships to come to the school and how are they going to be meted out? Okay. Questions like that were set in place a long time ago, very deliberately to make sure that there was only a white population at the school, that haven't been adjusted much at all, that continue to maintain an entirely white school population and a majority white teaching staff. There's something to look at there. It doesn't mean that everybody there is wrong, but there is something to look at there, especially when there's a black population right around the school, many of whom would actually like to come to the school, but don't have access to be able to get in for different reasons. Okay. So we could get into the details of all of that. Are there other reasons? Again, I think Neil does a good job of this. Yeah, there's other reasons than just racism that all of these things have happened. It's not all racist. But I might want to look and just see, are there things that are still in place that actually still have racist effects that we just haven't paid attention to? There's an example.
Neil, go ahead. You have some examples in your book of systemic racism. I think it's in hiring, example in policing, a few others. Your thoughts when you hear that kind of example and that as a tool that we should look at, even though it's a part of critical race theory, how much should we borrow from that to ask the kind of questions Ed is asking?
Well, so we're careful. We tend to not use the term systemic racism at all because of how it's conceptualized by critical race theorists and others. And so it's a very broad term today. But what I will say is one of the very common conceptualizations among critical race theorists, not just Kendi and D'Angelo, but more broadly than that, is that wherever you see racial disparities, there is systemic racism at work. So they sort of equate the two. Now, I know Ed does not do that. He's very clear in his book that these disparities they're not always caused by racism. He agrees with that. I agree with that. But it's common among critical race theorists to go right from, I see disparities, there must be racism either right now, or we're seeing a legacy of racism, or we're seeing something bad that needs to be fixed. And as we point out in the book, that's not always true. And by seeing this is way too broad of a brush, because when you say if disparities equal discrimination or disparities equal something wrong, well, first of all, logically, that's just obviously not true. For example, in the NBA, I think 70% of players in the NBA are black. We do not think there's some conspiracy to keep whites and Asians out of the NBA. That's just not there. So again, Kendi does actually say literally every disparity is caused solely by discrimination, and if you disagree, you are racist. That's a quote from his book. But I tend to say, hey, so Pat and I affirm, are there institutions that are actually racist in their policies intentionally? Yes, there are. They're not widespread like everywhere, but there are actually racist companies, racist businesses, or either de jure, usually de facto because it's illegal, but they exist. And let me do a conservative one. The Supreme Court just decided that affirmative action at Harvard was discriminating against Asians, and it was therefore illegal based on civil rights law. So that's, by their definition, I think it's fair, and even by mine, that's systemic racism. It's policies that are intentionally keeping Asians out of the school merely because they're Asian. That's immoral. But we have to understand there. So what I do is I think either in our book, also somewhere else I've done this. I said there's sort of 4 categories I use. There are laws and policies that intentionally harm people of color. Those are always bad. If you're trying to, that's racist. That's actually historically, traditionally racist. That's bad. Yeah. Number 2, there are laws and policies that unintentionally harm people of color. It's accidental. Like you made some rule, but you had no idea. So a simple example of this would be dress codes. People would say like you have to. A good example that happens a lot is dreadlocks are considered unprofessional, right? And they would say, hey, it's colorblind. Whites in dreadlocks, blacks in dreadlocks. That's even standards. You're like, but wait a minute. How many whites go around wearing dreadlocks? It happens to be a predominantly black hairstyle. Is that really? You're not intending to hurt black people. But maybe that's not a good policy to have. But it's unintentional. You're not intending to kick out black professionals. Then there's 3. There's unconscious biases that harm people of color. There's sociological studies we cite in our book. People don't, when you interview blacks and whites, all things being equal, the blacks get fewer callbacks. Is it because the interviewers are racist? Maybe it's just they have stereotypes. But it's unintentional, but it's unconscious, but it's there. And if you're a black interviewee, that's bad for you. That's not really right. And so we should work to undermine those unconscious biases however we can. And then finally, there's harm from historical racism that continues today. So you can look at city maps and look at how there's still very concentrated pockets of black poverty. And some of those were created intentionally by various housing policies. Again, that's a legacy thing. And no one today is out there saying we got to keep blacks in these areas. But that harmed people. Can we as Christians and we should say, how can we work to remedy these negative consequences of past racism? My only point is, hey, we should be careful and precise when we talk about racism broadly, because we don't want to put things that are completely unintentional with things that are intentional. We don't want to confuse things that are they're actually good policies, even though they have disparate effects. A simple example: you don't want to have a quota that says you have to have 70% whites in the NBA. No, that would fix disparities, but it would be a bad policy. Only point is say, be nuanced, be careful, be precise, and don't lump all this stuff under one heading of racism. That's my comment.
Good, and I agree. Well, I agree with everything Neil just said. I just want to say that I thought that was a wonderful list, and again, I think we all are having different experiences. Neil's in North Carolina, you're in LA, I'm in the middle of Ohio. Those are 3 radically different places where race is being lived out. And I would say the majority of my white friends who, again, are in church, parachurch organization, they don't stop to think in all those categories, though. The question was, what is a critical race theory that's being underused or that could actually be beneficial to us in the church? I think, Sean, that's how you said it. Maybe you just some different words.
Sure.
Racism is endemic. It's hardwired into the system. Again, whatever language, it's normal. It's become normalized. Everything that Neil just said and what I just said is how it can be useful. That theory, that idea should cause us to slow down and just look through that lens to see how there is disparities that have been created because of patterns and policies that we're maybe not aware of. And all the 4 categories that Neil just said. That doesn't mean it's always only race or racial. Yes, I agree. Again, that's an extreme application, an extreme take. Kendi is being intentionally provocative in every one of his chapters. He's purposely poking the bear on everything. And I think he's wrong in some of his conclusions in his chapters. But he's riding the train all the way to the end on that idea. And he's built a platform on it, and he's got lots of people talking about it as a result, which I just think is interesting as a strategy. But there's a ton in that idea or that theory that's worth exploring inside of Christian spaces. That in and of itself is not an evil idea to think about and consider.
All right, I've got 2 last questions for both of you because we need to somewhat bring this towards the end. And here's what the 2 questions are so you can be in the back of your mind. Number 1, what do you hope to see change as a result of your book? And would you recommend the other's book? And if so, why or why not, with any qualifications? So let's start with, what do you hope to see change as a result of your book? Neil, go ahead.
I just want Christians to be informed and to understand these ideas. I think I agree with Ed that many people, both on the pro and con side, don't understand these ideas well. I want them to be exposed to primary literature, to really read them in their own words, to even be able to say, hey, what are they saying that they get right? To not say it's all just demon words and satanic. They know there are actually some things that they get right. But then I do want them to Christians to be more aware of, at its heart, all these ideas, or at least many of them, and certainly when considered as a whole, they're bad. We need to say no to them, and that saying no to critical race theory does not mean saying yes to racism or to racial indifference. It does not. We can reject CRT, we can reject racism, we can reject racial indifference all at the same time. That's totally okay. And the second question, would I recommend Ed's book?
Actually, hold that for a second. Hold your thoughts on that one for a second. Okay. Ed, what do you hope to see change as a result of your book?
So I just wrote this to somebody the other day, and I'm just going to read it because it's actually, I thought this is a really good summary. I said, the book is not just about the CRT debate, and the title is in some ways almost misleading. It's really an effort to help white church folks in particular to understand why non-white folks so often feel the way they do in majority culture spaces, and what we can do to move forward in a healthier way. It also demonstrates how CRT can actually aid in that process if we'll slow down long enough to ask the questions actual CRT wants us to ask. Neil said they're bad ideas. And again, I hate to say what I'm about to say, but I don't think they're all bad ideas. I think they can be bad applications. I don't think they're all bad ideas to wrestle with. And again, we differ over that. But that's how I would answer that. And so what I hope will happen is that this book will fall into the hands of people who I'm hoping are not susceptible to falling over the edge of critical theory as a worldview. I don't want my book to be used as an endorsement or a way to pull someone away from orthodoxy. I'm afraid of that. In the same way, I don't want Neil's book to be used as a way to allow people who actually need to be confronted with some of this racial stuff to continue to not look at it because they have his book as an excuse not to look at it in the way that they should. But I hope people will slow down and they'll gain understanding to why things are the way they are, and maybe learn something if they'll think about the CRT concepts as applied to the church.
Well, I said it before and I'll say it again, that I would recommend both of your books in the sense that they're both well-researched. You both have a heart for evangelism. You have a heart for the church. They both stretched me in different ways. And so any readers are going to, or people who watch this are going to agree more with you, Neil, or more with you, Ed. That's fine. If you only read stuff that makes you comfortable and you agree with, what's the point? What's the point? So if I did a class in this, maybe I will down the road at some point, I would use both, and I would challenge my students to really think about it and wrestle through the ideas.
Well,
that's where I stand.
Can we still answer the question? Do we still have time to answer that question?
I was going to do the second question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Neil. I want to hear what Neil would say, whether he would recommend it or not.
Yeah, I would recommend it in this sense. I think, Ed, your book is the best book that I've read that is coming from, I know you wouldn't like this, but the pro-CRT perspective. Or call it at least the moderate, if you want to put it that way, moderate CRT perspective. If you want a book that is going to be right about identifying the errors and the dangers of what you call the progressive worldview, your book does that, right? And it's going to be the best book in terms of being honest about that, but then also presenting CRT in its most favorable light. Although I would say this, I do think ultimately your book, the central thesis is that CRT is not that dangerous, not that bad, or at least the threat is exaggerated. I strongly disagree with that thesis. But I guess, like Sean said, I am all about dialogue. I'm all about people reading broadly. So what I would say is pick up Ed's book and then pick up an anti-CRT book. And this is where I've tried to make it Pat and I try to focus on the primary sources. Read, and that my thing would, don't even read my book. Read a book written by a critical race theorist and compare them. And I do want you to get both perspectives and then decide for yourselves what is accurately representing the theorist, and then two, what reflects biblical sound theology. That's what I want you to land on. And so that's why I'd say Ed's the best book that I've read coming from that, call it pro-CRT perspective.
Thank you, Neil. And I said this, and I think I still believe this. I wish I had your book before I started my PhD program. It would have helped me understand what was going on much sooner, especially the first half of the book where you're just laying out the philosophies. You're really expanding and going way beyond. You got 200 more pages to work with than I did. You're expanding and going way beyond, and you deserve it because you do want to quote primary sources, and you are prolific in the way you try to gather and put it all down on paper. I would give people your book on the way in, and I would give them my book on the way out, because I think mine is full of real situations that people find themselves in, and it's trying to understand why it is. Again, I'm not going to speak for Black people, but I've been around enough and in conversation enough that I think I can reflect at least what some Black voices would say about these things and why it is they feel the way they feel in majority culture spaces within white evangelicalism.
Fellas, amazing conversation. It's been over 2 hours, and there's a ton more questions I have for you, but I think we got to the meat of it, similarities, highlighted some key differences. If you think we've covered what they cover in your book and you only need to watch this podcast, you got about 20% of what they each at most discuss in their books. So check out Critical Dilemma by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. And then a book coming out June 25th. I'm assuming you can pre-order it right now, Ed, called Untangling Critical Race Theory. Read them both. Go back, check out original sources. Use them as talking points with your kids, with your friends of the same rate, different race, and hopefully advance a conversation in small ways makes a difference. Before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other conversations like this coming up, trying to model just civil, fair, respectful dialogue across differences to bring clarity amongst Christians and amongst others. And my vote, fellas, is that we accomplished that well today. So appreciate both of you. Now, if you've thought about studying apologetics, make sure you check out Biola online. We have the top-rated program, totally distance program. If you're not ready for a master's but just want some apologetics training, we have a certificate program and a great discount. So check that out below. And we'll see you on upcoming episodes. Thanks again, guys.